Please don't send me back. A farmer found an alien woman in a sack. The barn door groaned as Miles Vaynar pushed it open, lantern swinging in his hand. Cold air came in behind him, dry and sharp against his face. It was late, and he should have been in bed, but habit always drove him to check the animals and supplies before turning in. A farmer had to be certain everything was in order, especially on the edge of a dying colony where no one came to help if things went wrong. Miles wasn't just a farmer by trade. He'd been a frontier scout years earlier, before the settlements collapsed into silence and barter replaced currency. He had seen what hunger did to men. He had walked the perimeters of dying towns where law meant nothing. That history had shaped him into a man who never trusted luck and who double-checked even small details. Tonight, the barn was his last stop before rest. He scanned the stalls. The mule shifted in its pen, hooves scraping lightly on wood. Tools were lined where he'd left them, the grain sacks stacked high in the corner. Nothing seemed out of place until he noticed it. One sack trembled. Just once, but enough to stop him mid-step. He froze, lantern lifted higher. Mice could cause a twitch, but this was heavier, more controlled. He set the lantern on a beam support, freeing his hands. The familiar weight of his belt knife pressed against his hip, and he drew it slowly. Years of scouting came back in the careful way. He lowered his steps, balanced, ready. The sack shifted again, deliberate this time. Something alive was inside. His mind went over the possibilities. Stray dog? Injured animal? Someone's attempt at theft? Hiding goods? But the knot at the top of the sack wasn't tied from the outside. It had been worked tight from the inside. That stopped him. Whoever or whatever was inside had climbed it on purpose. He crouched and kept his grip firm on the sack's throat. His voice came out calm, deliberate. "All right, we're going slow." He cut the rope cleanly. The fabric fell open, and a pale arm slid out, not the color of any settler he'd ever seen. The skin had a faint violet hue, smooth and faintly luminous under the lantern glow. Thin fingers twitched, not in attack but in weakness. Inside the sack, curled against the rough canvas, was a woman. Not human. Long white hair lay tangled across her face and shoulders. Her body was wrapped in torn silver-threaded fabric, ceremonial by design, but shredded and exposing more than it covered. Her lips were cracked, her eyes half shut. She tried to move, but lacked the strength. She blinked up at him, saw the knife, and her throat worked around a hoarse whisper. "Please don't send me back." Miles didn't answer right away. He studied her, steady and measured. His instincts told him this wasn't a thief or a trap. This was desperation. He slid the knife back into its sheath and stepped back, giving her room to breathe. Her words echoed. Back to where? To whom? He didn't ask immediately. Instead, he fetched his wool coat, shook the dust from it, and laid it within her reach. Not on her. That would have been a claim she wasn't ready to accept. "Put on," he said. "Then we'll figure the rest out." She looked at the coat like it was a trick, then pulled it over her shoulders. The fabric swallowed her frame. Her bare feet shifted on the wooden floor, toes curled against the cold. When she tried to stand, her knees buckled. Miles steadied the sack itself, bracing it so she could use it for balance. He never touched her skin. Once she was upright, he offered the lantern. "Hold it up so I can see you properly." She obeyed, lifting it with trembling arms. The light revealed more. Faint abrasions along her collarbones, the ring of dull metal circling her wrist, etched with patterns he didn't recognize. Her face was delicate but hardened by strain, her expression torn between pride and exhaustion. He asked carefully, "Who are you?" Her voice was faint but clear. "Cereal." The name sat heavy in the barn air. Miles kept his tone neutral. "And what are you doing inside my grain sack?" Her lips tightened, as if ashamed of her answer. Grain masked scent. Warms the body. Men don't look inside sacks when they're tired. Practical, not mad. A survival choice. He respected that. Miles set down the knife and pulled water from a tin cup, passing it to her without ceremony. "Drink." She stared at it, then at him, suspicion flickering in her eyes. Still, she raised it and drank in slow sips. The tremor in her throat eased, color returning faintly to her lips. He waited until she lowered the cup before asking, What did you mean? Don't send you back. Her jaw clenched. Her voice thinned. Back to them. To the priests. To the binding. She tapped the metal ring on her wrist with 2 fingers. They call it union. It is prison. Miles absorbed that in silence. She wasn't running from soldiers or slavers. She was running from her own people, from a ritual meant to erase her choice. He made his decision quickly. He'd seen enough broken men and women abandoned by their own kind during the collapse. He wasn't going to throw her out into the night. He fetched a folded blanket and set it near her feet. You'll sleep in the farmhouse. Floor by the stove's warmest. Her eyes snapped to his, wide with both hope and disbelief. You would keep me here? He shrugged, practical, steady. You asked me not to send you back. That's good enough for tonight. For the first time, she looked directly at him without flinching. Her eyes, pale and luminous, softened. Then tonight, I am here. Miles nodded. It was settled. She would stay. Not forever, not promised. Just here now. That was all she needed to hear. As he led her toward the farmhouse, lantern casting long shadows over the dirt path, he kept his thoughts quiet. He didn't know what kind of trouble might follow her. He didn't know what her people would do if they found her. But he knew one thing clearly. She was terrified of belonging to anyone. If she was going to stay under his roof, he had to prove she was free there. And that was a responsibility he could accept. The farmhouse door closed behind them with a dull thud, shutting out the cold. The room was small and plain. Iron stove in the center, a scarred wooden table with 2 mismatched chairs, a shelf of chipped cups, and a single trunk pressed against the wall. It smelled of ash, boiled grain, and old leather. Miles set the lantern down on the table and gestured for Cereal to sit near the stove. She lowered herself slowly, her legs still weak, the coat sliding half off her shoulders. The fire snapped, sending a faint orange glow across her skin, and he noticed how carefully she wrapped the fabric around herself, not to protect from the cold, but from his gaze. Miles poured her a bowl of stew from the dented pot, thick with root vegetables and a strip of cured meat. He set it down in front of her with a spoon, then pulled back, deliberately not sitting across from her, but instead leaning against the table at a distance. She hesitated before lifting the spoon, her eyes darting toward him as if expecting him to snatch it back. He didn't. She tasted a small bite, chewing slowly, watching him. Only when she had eaten half the bowl did she finally speak. You live here alone. Yes, Miles said simply. Why? His answer was as plain as his tone. Fewer problems that way. He didn't explain further, but his mind flickered back to the collapsed settlements, to disputes over water rights, to men drawing knives over a half-empty sack of grain. He had seen enough of that. Solitude meant survival. Cereal's eyes lingered on him, pale lavender catching the firelight. I thought humans always stayed in groups. Families. Clans. Used to, he said. Not much left of that now. Her spoon paused halfway to her lips. So, no one comes here? Not often. He studied her carefully, reading the intent behind her question. Fear, not curiosity. No one knows you're here. No one will. Unless you want them to. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. The tension in her jaw eased, but only slightly. She put the spoon down, fingers pressing against the table's rough edge. They'll look for me. Miles let the words settle. He had wondered the same thing in the barn, but hadn't asked. Now is the time. Who are they? Cereal's throat tightened as she answered. My own. My people. Her hand went to the ring at her wrist, covering it, as if ashamed. They said it was honor. So it was my duty. They promised a union, a binding. But it wasn't a choice. It never was. They would have made me property, not a woman, not myself. Her words carried weight, not theatrical, just raw. She didn't look at him when she spoke. She looked at the fire, as if afraid that meeting his eyes might make her confession heavier. Miles absorbed it in silence, jaw tightening slightly. He had seen people stripped of choice before, though usually by hunger or violence, not by tradition dressed up as honor. He didn't try to offer comfort. He knew empty assurances meant nothing. Instead, he said, steady and clear, "You're not property here. That's not how it works." Her gaze snapped up to him, searching his face for a catch, for some sign that his words were another kind of trap. She found none, but mistrust clung to her anyway. Men say that, she whispered. They say one thing, then they take what they want. Miles didn't look away. Then stay awake tonight. Watch me. See if I do. The fire popped in the stove, filling the silence that followed. She studied him, eyes narrow, testing, waiting for a crack in his voice or his posture. But he stood as he always did, calm, steady, deliberate. The kind of presence that wasn't performed, just lived. Finally, she picked up the spoon again and finished the stew without another word. When she was done, he took the bowl, rinsed it at the basin, and set it aside. He pointed to the blanket and pillow laid out by the stove. That's yours for tonight. It's warmest here. She glanced at the door. And you? I'll sit there. He pulled out the straight-back chair by the entry and dropped into it with the ease of a man who had kept watch more nights than he could count. I sleep light. If anyone comes, I hear it first. Her lips pressed together, unreadable. Maybe it was relief, maybe suspicion. She pulled the blanket around her and laid down on the floor. The coat slipped open, exposing the line of her shoulder, but she didn't adjust it this time. Her eyes stayed open, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the quiet. Miles didn't move or speak, and the silence became something solid between them, heavy but not hostile. Minutes passed, the fire's glow dimming as the night deepened. Serial's breathing slowed, though her eyes remained open, fighting sleep. Miles leaned back in the chair, boots planted firmly on the floor, arms crossed loosely. He thought about what she had said about the priests and the binding. He didn't know the customs of her people, but he knew coercion when he heard it. He told himself he was only offering her a place to rest for the night, nothing more. Yet part of him already knew this wasn't going to end with one night. When her eyes finally closed and her breathing steadied, he allowed himself a long look at her. Not as a man assessing beauty, but as someone measuring fragility, someone who understood how little it took to break a person when they were already on the edge. He turned his gaze back to the door and kept watch. Serial shifted once in her sleep, murmuring something in a language he didn't know, clutching at the blanket as though still bracing for someone to pull it away. Miles's hand rested near the knife on his belt, not because he expected trouble from her, but because habit demanded readiness. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows. Inside, the farmhouse held steady. One man sat guard while the woman he had found in a sack slept by his stove, and for the first time in what might have been years, neither of them was entirely alone. Dawn crept into the farmhouse slowly, a faint gray light pushing past the shutters. The stove had gone quiet, but its iron shell still radiated a fading warmth. Miles stirred first, his body used to rising early no matter how little sleep he managed. His boots scraped softly against the floor as he stood, stretching out stiff muscles. The chair by the door had kept him upright all night, but he hadn't minded. Years of scouting had trained him to sleep in worse conditions, and watching over someone vulnerable was something that came naturally, whether he admitted it or not. Serial lay curled by the stove, blanket pulled to her chin, her breathing even. For a moment, Miles studied her silently, noting the small details he hadn't paid attention to in the haze of last night. The faint blue veins visible just beneath the violet tint of her skin, the way her long white hair tangled around her face, the shallow lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes. She wasn't just tired, she was drained, as if weeks of strain had hollowed her out. He moved toward the kitchen shelf, keeping his steps quiet. He set water to boil, dropped in dried roots, and sliced what little bread was left from yesterday. The simple tasks grounded him. It was easier to focus on practical work than to let his mind wander toward what her presence meant. The smell of warm broth stirred her awake. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the light. She blinked at the unfamiliar ceiling, then shifted under the blanket, realizing where she was. Panic flickered across her face for a split second, a reflex, but it softened when she saw him standing near the stove, his back turned as he worked. "You kept the door locked," she said quietly, her voice rasping from sleep. "Habit," Miles answered without looking at her. "Not a cage. Keys on the table if you want it." Her gaze flicked to the key resting by the lantern. The gesture disarmed her. Most men would never have given her that option. She pushed herself up slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. You really don't fear I'll run? You came here on your own, he said simply, pouring broth into a cup. Running back out into the cold doesn't seem like something you want. She didn't reply, but the way her hands tightened around the blanket betrayed her inner struggle. He brought her the cup, set it in her hands, and crouched so she wouldn't have to look up at him. She sipped, the hot liquid easing the tightness in her throat. After a moment, she asked the question she had held back since the night before. Why do you live out here, apart from others? Most humans cling together. You don't. Miles sat back on his heels, considering how much to share. He didn't like talking about himself, but he understood her need to know. I was a scout, he said finally. Spent years walking the borders when the colonies were still holding. When everything broke down, I didn't go back to the towns. Didn't see a reason. Out here, it's quiet. Fewer mouths to feed, fewer hands to point at what isn't theirs. And no one you miss? She pressed, curiosity sharper now. He paused, his expression hardening for just a moment. No one left, he said. His voice didn't carry sadness, just a blunt truth. She studied him carefully, searching for weakness in his tone, but found only finality. For the first time, she looked at him without suspicion. Her voice softened. Then we are both without a place. Her words lingered in the air. Miles didn't comment, but his jaw tightened, and he turned back to the stove to hide the reaction. He hadn't planned on keeping her beyond the night, but already he could feel the edges of that decision shifting. As she ate the bread he offered, her eyes moved again to the metal band at her wrist. He noticed her trying to cover it with the blanket. This time, he didn't ignore it. That ring, he said. What does it do? Her hand froze. Silence stretched before she answered. It binds, not with force you can see, but with the force of what it means. Once it's closed, you are someone's. The priests call it sacred. I call it chain. Miles leaned forward, his voice steady. Does it track you? No. But if they see it on me, they know. They'll say I belong to someone. The admission explained more than she realized. The constant tension in her shoulders, the way she flinched at small kindnesses. Miles reached for a hammer resting on the workbench, weighed it in his hand, and set it on the table between them. We could take it off. Her eyes widened. No. If you try to break it and fail, it could tighten. Some don't survive that. He held her gaze, his expression unreadable. Then we'll wait until we know how. But it's coming off, one way or another. She stared at him, shocked by the certainty in his tone. Men she had known before spoke in promises that dissolved. He spoke as if the decision was already made. For the first time, she felt something stir beneath her fear. Not trust yet, but the faint recognition of someone who might actually mean what he said. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Miles stepped outside to tend the animals, his boots crunching in the frost. Cereal stayed by the stove, sipping the last of the broth, her eyes following the crack of light slipping through the shutters. She clutched the blanket close, her mind torn between relief and the gnawing question she hadn't yet voiced. How long could this last before someone came looking? When Miles returned, he carried firewood and set it beside the stove. His expression was the same calm mask as always, but his eyes flicked toward her, measuring. He didn't say it aloud, but both of them understood. The fragile arrangement they had built in a single night was now something more than temporary. And that was the first step toward danger neither of them had planned for. By the second night, the farmhouse no longer felt like a place she had stumbled into by chance. It felt like the thin line between her survival and the hands that might one day drag her back. Cereal sat near the stove again, this time upright, more awake than the night before. The blanket still clung to her shoulders, but she no longer held it like armor. Miles prepared the evening meal with quiet efficiency, chopping dried roots and adding them to the simmering pot. His movements were simple, steady, but not careless. Every action was deliberate, and that steadiness made it harder for her to keep her guard raised. When he set down the food, she did not hesitate as long as before. She ate, slowly at first, then with more confidence. Between bites, her eyes studied the man across the table. He had changed out of his worn coat into a simple wool shirt, sleeves rolled to his forearms, skin brown from long days under the sun. His hands were rough but controlled, the hands of a man who worked the land but had not forgotten the discipline of a soldier. She wondered why he had left the life of a scout behind. He had said little of it, and she suspected there was more. "You said you were a scout," she finally asked, breaking the silence. "Did you leave because of war?" Miles paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. He set it down, leaning back slightly in his chair. War didn't end. It just stopped having sides. After that, it was scavengers, raiders, desperate men. Same fight, no flag. I'd seen enough of it. His voice carried no bitterness, only fact. "So I came here, far enough to be left alone." "And it worked?" she asked. "Mostly." His eyes lifted to hers. "Until you hid in my grain." She flinched, but his tone wasn't cruel. There was even a trace of dry humor in it, though his face didn't show much. He continued, "I should be asking what happens if they come here for you. If you're worth chasing." Her spoon clattered against the bowl. Her breath caught, shoulders stiff. "They won't come," she said quickly, but her eyes betrayed the lie. "Not what I asked." His voice stayed calm, but it pressed. "Are you worth chasing?" She swallowed hard. Her hand went to the metal band on her wrist. "Not to me, but to them. Yes, because if they take me back and finish the binding, they can claim me. Claim everything I do, everything I bear. That is what they chase." The fire popped sharply in the stove. Miles didn't look away from her. His jaw tightened, his storm gray eyes measuring her words. He had asked the question because he needed to know what danger he'd invited into his home. Now he knew. Not soldiers, not traitors, but tradition itself. A chain dressed as honor. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he reached forward and slid the empty bowl from her hands, setting it aside. Then he leaned in, forearms resting on the table, his voice low and controlled. "You stay here, you follow my rules. That means honesty. If someone does come, I need to be ready. No surprises." Her chin lifted, pride flaring even through her exhaustion. "And if I'm not honest, then you leave," he said without hesitation. The words cut sharper than he intended, and he saw it land on her. She recoiled slightly, clutching the blanket tighter, as if bracing for him to throw her out immediately. He didn't move, letting the silence stretch, letting her process the weight of the condition. Finally, her voice broke the quiet. "I don't want to leave." He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Then don't." It was the closest thing to reassurance he would give her, but it was real. She sat back in her chair, shoulders sagging, the fight draining from her posture. She stared at the fire, lips pressed tight, and whispered something so faint he almost missed it. "I don't know how to be free." Miles didn't answer right away. He studied her, the way her hands twisted the fabric of the blanket, the faint tremor in her fingers. She wasn't lying. She was a woman who had fled her people's control, but she carried the weight of it still, even here. He realized then that the danger wasn't just someone knocking on his door. It was the fear she carried inside, the belief that she would never be her own. When he finally spoke, his words were steady, plain, without decoration. "You start by choosing. Tonight, you chose to stay. That's a start." Her eyes flicked to him, uncertain, almost suspicious, but the hint of relief was there. She pulled the blanket tighter and lowered her head, hiding her expression. Miles rose from the table and checked the lock on the door, his movements quiet, deliberate. When he returned, he placed another log into the stove, the fire crackling back to life. He didn't look at her as he spoke again. "You'll get stronger. When you do, you can decide what's next. Until then, you eat, you rest, and you don't hide in sacks." For the first time, her lips curved in the shadow of a smile, faint but real. She shook her head slightly, long white hair falling across her face. "I never want to see another sack." He allowed himself a short breath that might have been close to a laugh, though he kept it low. "Good." The night deepened. She stretched out by the stove again, pulling the blanket around her, eyes heavy. Miles returned to his chair by the door, his boots set firm on the floor, knife at his side. Their fragile truce had held another day. And though neither said it aloud, both of them knew the question pressing closer now than ever. How long could this quiet hold before the outside world demanded its due? The next morning brought pale sunlight through the farmhouse shutters, a thin gray light that softened the rough edges of the small room. Miles was already outside when Serial stirred awake, the sound of his boots on frozen earth carrying faintly through the walls. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around her, and for a long moment she simply listened. The rhythmic scrape of a shovel, the low creak of the barn door, the faint snore of the mule. It was the sound of routine, of a life that moved with steady order. It was the opposite of the chaos she had fled. When he came back inside, his sleeves were rolled up, forearms streaked faintly with dirt. He set down a bucket of water by the stove and nodded at her. "You can use this to wash. Better than nothing." Her eyes lingered on the bucket, then on him. The simple offer carried more weight than she expected. Most men would have used her vulnerability to strip away what dignity she had left. He offered her privacy instead. She dipped her hands into the cold water, flinching at the chill, and scrubbed her arms, her face, even the edges of her long white hair. When she looked up, he had turned his back, fussing with tools at the table, deliberately giving her space. "Why are you like this?" she asked suddenly, her voice sharper than intended. He glanced over his shoulder. "Like what?" "Not taking, not demanding. You speak as if you have no claim on me." Miles set the tools down, wiped his hands on a rag, and met her eyes without hesitation. "Because I don't." The simplicity of the answer startled her. She searched his expression for hidden intent, but found nothing. Only a steady calm, the same as always. She swallowed, her throat tight, and turned back to the water. Later that day, she followed him outside for the first time. The cold bit at her bare feet, but she kept pace as he moved across the field, showing her the plots of frost-covered soil. His farm wasn't large, but it was his, and the order of the place reflected his discipline. Tools were stored neatly, rows were precise, fences solid. Even the animals seemed calmer under his quiet authority. "Why show me this?" she asked. "Because if you're staying, you should know what keeps me alive," he said, "and what you'll eat tomorrow." Her lips pressed together, not sure if she should thank him or argue, but she kept silent and followed. At the barn, she tried to lift a small bucket of grain to help, but the weight forced her to stagger. Miles reached out, steadying it with one hand before it tipped. His other hand brushed over hers for only a second, but it lingered in her mind longer than it should have. He took the bucket easily, carried it to the stall, and looked back at her. "You don't need to prove yourself by breaking your back." The words carried more meaning than he likely realized. For so long, every choice she had made was judged, measured, found wanting. Here, he dismissed the idea entirely. The knot in her chest loosened slightly. That evening, they sat by the stove again. She watched him repair a broken handle with practiced movements, his fingers working the wood with precision. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It had shifted into something almost comfortable. Still, she broke it with a question that had been gnawing at her. "If they came here, if they stood at your door, would you give me back?" Miles didn't look up from his work. "Not unless you walk to them yourself." Her breath caught. It was the answer she had wanted, but hearing it aloud struck deeper than she expected. She looked away quickly, blinking hard, her hands tightening around the blanket. "Then I'll never walk to them." He finally raised his eyes, watching her carefully. The tremor in her voice wasn't fear, it was conviction. He nodded once, returning to his work, but his chest tightened faintly at the certainty in her tone. That night, as she lay by the stove, her body wrapped in warmth instead of canvas, she whispered softly to herself, almost too low for him to hear, "Please let this last." Miles didn't answer, but from his chair by the door, his hand tightened around the armrest, and his eyes stayed fixed on the dark beyond the shutters. The quiet between them was no longer fragile. It was beginning to hold. The third night settled heavier than the others, a damp chill seeping through the walls of the farmhouse. The stove fire burned strong, but the wind outside found every crack and whispered through. Serial sat closer to the heat, her knees drawn up, the blanket wrapped around her slender frame. She had eaten. She had bathed. She had seen the fields and the mule, but the weight on her chest had not lifted. Miles sat at the table, oiling the blade of his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. He did not speak often, but his silence was not empty. It was the silence of a man who had learned how to watch and wait. When she shifted uneasily, he glanced up. "You're not cold. You're restless." Her lips parted, but she didn't answer immediately. She stared into the fire, voice low. "I dream of them. The priests. The voices reciting vows I never agreed to. In the dream, I open my mouth to say no, but nothing comes out." He set the knife down carefully, the cloth folded beside it. "Dreams can't bind you." Her eyes flicked to his sharp, "But memory can. Even here I feel it, as if I am already theirs." She tugged at the metal ring on her wrist, the sound of skin against steel harsh in the quiet. "This thing says I belong to them. And what if you begin to believe the same?" Miles leaned back, chair creaking under his weight. He spoke plainly, without softness, but the truth in his voice carried its own comfort. "I don't need priests or rings to know what belongs to me. And I don't need either to know what doesn't." The words landed harder than he intended. Her throat tightened, and she looked away, blinking quickly. She wasn't used to a man drawing a line that left her free on the other side. She wanted to believe him, but fear dug deeper than reason. The wind slammed against the shutters, and she startled, the blanket slipping from her shoulder. Her violet skin caught the glow of the fire, bare for a moment before she clutched the fabric back around herself. Miles's gaze lingered, not leering, not claiming, but acknowledging what was in front of him. She noticed, and her chest tightened with something new. Not fear, not shame, but the dangerous beginning of wanting to be seen. He stood and moved to the stove, adding a log. The fire cracked louder, throwing sparks. "You're safe here tonight," he said again, the same words he had spoken the night he found her. Her breath caught. "And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," he said, steady, "is another choice. Yours." Silence stretched between them. She lowered herself onto the blanket by the stove, curling into it, but sleep didn't come. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling beams, every flicker of firelight drawing shadows across the wood. She hated how much her body trembled. Finally, she whispered, not to him, but to herself, "I don't want to be alone in this." Miles heard it. He pushed the chair back from the table and moved toward the stove. He crouched beside her, his presence solid, grounding. He didn't touch her, didn't reach for her, only set his hand on the floor near hers. The distance was deliberate. The choice was hers. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she let her hand slide closer until her fingers brushed against his. The contact was small, but the effect was sharp. She felt warmth, steadiness, a pulse that wasn't hers. Miles didn't move further. He let the moment stand. Her breath slowed. For the first time, the trembling stopped. She leaned her head against the side of his arm, hair falling across his sleeve. He stayed still, his body rigid with restraint, but his presence steady as stone. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the wind and the low crackle of the stove. When her eyes finally closed, her lips formed words she hadn't planned to say. "If they come, don't let them touch me." Miles's reply was low, controlled, a promise made without hesitation. "They won't." She believed him more than she believed herself. Sleep took her in small, uneven breaths, her body relaxing against his arm. He remained there long after, keeping watch, hand still beside hers on the floor, knife within reach, eyes fixed on the door. For the first time since she had crawled into the sack, she slept without waking from nightmares. And for the first time, Miles allowed himself to admit quietly, deep in the private recess of his mind, that she was no longer just a burden he had stumbled across. She was becoming his responsibility, and he wasn't sure he wanted to let her go. The following day passed under a thin, colorless sky. Miles worked the fields with a steady rhythm, chopping frost from the furrows, mending a broken fence post. Cereal followed him at a distance, her bare feet crunching lightly over the hardened ground. She carried small tasks, a basket, a bundle of twine, but her presence was more important than the work. For the first time, she was not hiding in shadow, but walking beside him, seen in daylight. She studied him when she thought he wasn't looking. The way his shoulders squared against the cold, the way his hands moved with quiet precision, the lines around his eyes that hinted at years spent under harsher suns. He was not a man of comforting words. He did not reach for her, did not coax her. Yet his silence was never cruel. It was weight she could lean against without fear of collapse. When the sun dipped, they returned to the farmhouse. The fire was lit, stew simmering in the pot. She sat on the floor by the stove as always, but tonight her gaze lingered on him longer. Miles leaned against the table, arms crossed, watching the firelight reflect in her pale lavender eyes. The blanket had slipped from her shoulders, exposing the smooth glow of her violet skin. She noticed his eyes flicker, and for once, she didn't cover herself. "You keep watching me," she said quietly, not as accusation but as fact. "I'd be blind not to," he answered, steady, without shame. The air thickened. She didn't lower her gaze. "And if I want to be seen?" His jaw tightened. He stepped closer, slow, measured, until he crouched beside her by the stove. The fire crackled between them, shadows cutting across his face. "Then you decide what that means." "Not me." Her lips parted, a faint tremor in her breath. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the faint trace of earth and smoke clinging to him. She shifted slightly, leaning just enough that her shoulder brushed his arm. It was not an accident. His eyes searched hers, storm gray steady against her flickering lavender. He raised a hand but stopped just short her cheek, waiting. Her breath hitched, and she leaned into the touch herself, pressing her face into his rough palm. The gesture was small, but it carried more weight than any vow she had ever been forced to speak. She whispered, voice unsteady, "I was taught that closeness always takes something, that always costs." Miles's thumb brushed lightly along her cheekbone. "Not here. Not with me. You choose what it is." The silence between them trembled like a rope pulled tight. Her chest rose sharply, her lips parting, her body caught between fear and want. Finally, she leaned forward, her forehead resting against his. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The contact was simple, yet it carried every unspoken word between them. Then she closed the distance. Her lips pressed against his, soft, hesitant but deliberate. It was not a kiss of surrender, but of testing, of reaching for something she had been denied. Miles returned it carefully, restrained, his hand steady on her cheek. He didn't pull her closer, didn't claim her. He let her decide how far it went. When she pulled back, her breath was shaky, her eyes wide. "I don't feel like property," she whispered. "You never were," he said firmly. Her body trembled, not from fear this time, but from the unfamiliar weight of relief. She pressed her face against his chest, clutching the fabric of his shirt with her fingers. He wrapped one arm around her shoulders, holding her, not tightly but securely. She felt his strength in the embrace, steady and unwavering, a promise carried not in words but in presence. For the first time in her life, intimacy didn't feel like a cage. It felt like freedom. They stayed like that until the fire burned low, her body slowly relaxing against his. When she finally whispered, "I don't want this to end," his reply came without hesitation, low and grounded. "Then don't let it." The night no longer belonged to fear or ritual. It belonged to them. The morning broke clear, the frost sharp across the ground, but the air calmer than it had been for days. Miles was already outside when Serial woke. She rose from the blanket by the stove, her body sore but stronger than when she first curled inside that grain sack. For the first time, she didn't wrap herself in the blanket before stepping out of the farmhouse. Bare-shouldered in the cold, she followed the sound of his steady movements. He was in the field, splitting wood by the fence line. His swings were deliberate, each strike of the axe precise, the rhythm of a man who had built his life on repetition and discipline. When he looked up and saw her standing in the pale sunlight, his expression didn't change much, but something softened in his eyes. He set the axe down and rested his hands on the worn handle. "You should be warm inside," he said. "I've been warm enough," she answered. Her voice didn't tremble. She walked closer, her white hair catching the morning light, her bare feet pressing into the frozen earth. He saw the ring still clasped around her wrist, its etched surface dull in the cold. She followed his gaze and lifted her arm, letting the sunlight glint off it. "This doesn't own me anymore," she said. "Not unless I let it." He studied her carefully. "So what do you want instead?" Serial stepped closer, stopping just in front of him. Her eyes searched his face, her lips parting as if weighing every word before speaking. "I want to stay, not because I am hiding, not because you pity me. I want to stay because this is where I choose to be." The words cut through the morning air, sharp and final. For a long moment, neither spoke. Miles's chest tightened, a subtle shift in the mask of calm he usually wore. Then he reached forward, closing his hand gently around hers, not tugging, just holding. His storm gray eyes met hers, steady and unyielding. "Then you stay," he said. It was not a promise dressed in ritual or law. It was a choice made in the plainest words. And it was enough. Serial's breath caught, and she leaned forward, her forehead pressing against his chest. The rough fabric of his shirt scratched lightly against her skin, but the steady thud of his heartbeat was all she heard. His arms circled her, firm and protective, and she let the weight she had been carrying fall away. They returned to the farmhouse together. The day passed in simple tasks, fetching water, mending a hinge, tending the mule. She moved alongside him, learning the rhythm of his life, fitting herself into it piece by piece. Where her hands trembled carrying a pail, he steadied it with his own, their fingers brushing. When she brushed her hair back by the stove, he watched without hiding it. There was no ownership in his gaze, only recognition. That evening, as the fire burned low, she sat beside him at the table instead of the floor. He poured stew into 2 bowls, sliding one toward her. She didn't hesitate to take it. Their shoulders touched, the contact small but constant. After the meal, she turned to him, her voice quiet but clear. "The night you opened the sack, I beg you not to send me back. Tonight, I don't need to beg, because I know your answer." Miles set his hand over hers, firm and warm. "You're not going back. Not ever. You're here, with me." Relief washed over her face, but more than relief, something stronger, steadier. She leaned into him, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was no longer hesitant, no longer trembling. It was chosen, deliberate, and real. His arm slid around her, pulling her close, not as something fragile to be hidden, but as someone who belonged by his side. When the fire dimmed to embers and the farmhouse settled into quiet, Serial lay against him, her head resting on his chest, her fingers curled into his shirt. The ring on her wrist gleamed faintly in the glow, but it no longer mattered. It was a relic of what had tried to define her. It had no power here. Miles's hand smoothed through her hair as he spoke, low and steady. "You're safe now. Not for a night. Not for a season. For as long as you choose to stay." Her eyes closed, a faint smile touching her lips. "Then I choose forever." The wind outside moved gently through the fields, but the house stood firm, holding the warmth of 2 people who no longer needed to run. The story that began in a sack ended in a home, and for the first time, neither of them was alone.